I want to set the stage for what is coming in the next 45 minutes. It will be indeed bloopers. So let's try to learn something about the project and the past of the project while having some fun. You know, bloopers are kind of a difficult thing because you need to find things that everyone understands, that is not too much internal, that is not too embarrassing. So I figured I'd give it a try, and I tell you a bit of a story about NEOS. And obviously, every story must have their actors. So let me present your actors for this wonderful show coming up, the NEOS show. You have the overthinker, a very hard-thinking person. You have seen this person in here. And then you have our friend, the nitpicker. Also, he is very important for the project somehow. And then you have the untouchable. If you know what I'm playing at, then you will love about it. There is a very nice thing that Sebastian said on actually this stage, I think 3 years ago, and he said, "You can touch me anywhere you like." What he meant was, you can come and talk to me and discuss stuff with me whenever and wherever you like. But it didn't come out quite that well. Then we have the smug. Why is my slides not fully visible? That's somehow not helpful. Anyway, you see it at the grin. I mean, it's pretty obvious why this is the smug. Also a very important part of the team. Unfortunately, not here today. And then we have the couple. Our lovely couple. Also very important. Just one part is here. You have seen him before in the introduction. Very cool people. And we go on. With the ploingy. I didn't decide on that term. He decided on himself. A very famous feature of Ren's is the sound he can make, which he describes as ploing. So he is the ploingy. And we will hear from Ren's in person in a few minutes. Then you probably have seen this guy before. It's the windy gentleman. Very obvious why. You have the Joker, which jumps in always at the right time and the right place and fixes stuff and does things that no one expected someone to do. It's our Joker. And finally, you have the naughty. He does all the stuff that no one else does, all the naughty stuff, obviously. And finally, there's some guest appearance of the mysterious man with the hat. No idea who that is. Well, actually, I do. But this is, I mean, very mysterious and strange person that has some impact on our story at a later stage. That's the cast for today. And I want to apologize to all the rest of the team that doesn't appear in the cast. That is not because I wanted to exclude you or because you're not important, but just because I didn't find any discriminating pictures of you. So you are the lucky ones, basically. And this crew had a wonderful plan to do something amazing to the world of software. They wanted to do a next-generation communication system, a CMS. Just like this tiny little C3PO. And they started to work, and pretty soon a solution was coming up, and the solution didn't somehow look like the original plan, But the solution was more like a Russian doll where you finally had somewhere inside the communication system that you wanted, but around you needed a framework and a templating engine and a lot of other stuff. I mean, you needed more components until you finally had a CMS that we wanted. So that was quite a hard journey to get to the actual CMS. And I want to quote Robert from really back then. Number one topic for June is persistence. We really want to get this thing done, because what's a CMS without the ability to save content? And I mean, at that point in time, we could already render stuff. I mean, you could see stuff. There were HTTP requests, and you could have a template, basically, but you couldn't persist anything. Sometimes it works that way, but I mean, persistence is a hard topic, so you might want to postpone it until a time where you feel like you have an inspiration to do it right. That's how it goes. And I want to show you something from back then. We had regular...
Hi folks, and a very Merry Christmas from me, and of course from the Typo 3 Phoenix team.
I really love this because we had those regular sprint videos where we showed off the newest and wonderful features that we introduced, like persistence. And this was the Christmas edition. And as you see, Robert put the laptop in the snow. And you can imagine a MacBook gets quite hot on the bottom while you do stuff with it. So at the end of the video, actually, the MacBook was pretty wet. But OK, it worked somehow. So if you Google for it, you will find all these old sprint presentation videos. They're quite funny to look at from the perspective of now. So it's a recommendation. If you want to have more bloopers, just Google for it, watch those videos. They are quite fun, really. But let's go on to the name. You heard in the video the Typo 3 Phoenix team. And naming has a long tradition in this team. We are actually quite good, I mean, to find new names and new names and new names again. And I don't know, it's somehow fun to find new names. So I actually found this in the code. I mean, there was a time really at the beginning where this was unknown 3. Because at that point, obviously, no one was inspired enough to find a name. And the next name is quite more inspired, but I don't know, probably also not fitting for a professional audience. It was Beer 3. And we will come back to that later. We go on with the wonderful Phoenix. And then we had a code sprint where we actually thought about a name, and we had lots of wonderful ideas, or not so wonderful ideas. You know, after a few beers and after long nights of coding, you have ideas that are not really sensible. But you know, that is how you do brainstorming, basically. So yeah, we finally settled on some other stuff. But in between, I mean, there were namespaces introduced. So the first namespace was T3. Then it went on to F3. And finally to Typo 3. That's what we still have now. And a name was found on this code sprint with the very strange ideas we had, which I'm very happy about, that we found a name and that the name is quite OK. It's this one, Neos. And this is some ideas of logos that were put up somewhere before. So you might have seen 1 or 2 of those, maybe not all of them. Maybe the actual new Neos logo is in there. Who knows? But no, we found a new logo, a wonderful new logo. But this talk is a little too early, so I cannot show it. It's censored by the rest of the team. You will see it later. And small side note, this team is a real Windows killer. We had a lot of Windows users in this team, and one by one, they dropped their Windows systems and changed to Macs because it was just a pain to work on Windows with Flow and Neos. And it was even worse back then, and it's still not fun today. It can be fun if you use a virtual machine and stuff, but if you don't do it. Windows is really not the thing you want to run Neos on. I don't know, I think we actually don't have anyone using Windows anymore in the team right now. So there you go. So if you're a Windows user and you want to switch and you want to find a good reason, join the team, and you will be definitely convinced to change to something else in a matter of weeks. Really easy. Best way to change. I mean, I was always a proponent of Windows and Linux, and I never wanted to switch to a Mac. And at some point, I just bought a Mac because it worked. You know, that's how it goes in this team. So. Our wonderful crew. I said we will hear about our crew in person from Rennes. And this is a wonderful sentence out of another video that you can find on YouTube or Vimeo. And again, I recommend you to watch the full video. It's pretty cool from back then. But this sentence stuck, and I think everyone in the team has heard it one way or the other.
Phoenix is developed by a team which is pretty special. Yeah.
You know, what can you say? They are somehow special. I'm not sure what you intended to say by that, but you can interpret it in the way you like. I think it matches in any way you interpreted it. So let's look at the parts of this project that we developed over time. And obviously, we have to start with the framework. Flow these days has changed the name several times, as you might know. And there's one thing. You see, at the top is a commit message that was made in 2014. But actually, in my opinion, if you look at this commit, the actual commit message should have been first commit of new security framework, because that's what it was. Our wonderful SMOC prepared a great new security framework together with the naughty one, and it came out beautifully, and it was introduced somehow sneakily in this little commit. I mean, restructure policy component to new policy YAML format sounds like, oh, it's a pretty tiny change, and we did some adjustments to some formats, but in fact, it was a whole new security framework in there. And if you look at that from this perspective, looking back, 2008, there was actually a commit that said first commit of new security framework. And that was the first security framework back then in Flow, also done by the SMOC. I found it very funny somehow that the same person committed like the same first commit of security framework thing 2 times in a row after like 6 years in between. So this is also quite nice. I mean, final class T3 Flow 3 sounds like we are almost finished. But if you look at the namespace, I mean, you know that there was several changes in between. This is actually from 2008 or something. So there was nothing final about that all in all. And this class doesn't even exist anymore. It might be the bootstrap today, but even that is just a very loose comparison. We also try to be very modern in this development. As, especially back then, Robert and Carsten knew they would take quite a while to finish this project. They planned for using future stuff while they were developing. So they used features and stuff from PHP that were just in development, basically. And this is not exactly one of them, but I find it quite funny. Has any one of you ever used this Halt compiler? I didn't. And I had never heard about it before I looked into Flow. But there it was, Halt compiler, totally important. There are several commits about it, and it was put in and put out again. And finally, these days, we don't use it anymore. Back then, it was used to really stop the compiler at some specific point in reading a PHP file. That's what it does. I haven't tracked exactly what the changes were and where it was needed, but obviously it was needed. I don't know. I never would have the idea that this is a thing and this exists and why you would ever use it. But okay. We also introduced quite some wonderful features into this framework that you might have not seen. Did you know that you can run cache sys with 64738 as argument on the command line? This is an actual command. Cache sys, try it. It works. And the result of it is basically this. Because if you're old enough and you remember that, this is a way to reset a C64 system. And it prints out a very nice C64 resetted system thingy on your command line. So try it, it's fun. And it actually clears your caches. It's not just for show. So I said that we tried to be very modern. And one of those things was, back in the day, I don't know if you remember, but there was talk about the wonderful version PHP 6 that is coming up, and that has all the wonderful features. And one of the main features that was advertised for PHP 6 was actually Unicode support everywhere in the code. PHP right now has quite some problems with Unicode because some functions support it, some functions not. You need to know which do, and you need to have wrapper code. And the idea was, well, we prepare for PHP 6, which is around the corner basically and will come in a few months. And we basically implement functions that will appear in PHP 6 as PHP 6 functions. As you know, PHP 6 never happened. By now we are at PHP 7. PHP 6 was never released. We still have those functions. By now they are renamed to Unicode utilities. But actually the comment that said, this is a replacement for upcoming features and functions in PHP 6 was in the core until last month, basically. So yeah, that's how it goes sometimes with the code. Then another thing that I was very surprised to find out is that we actually had a RestController since 2008. I don't know. I mean, we had talks about services and REST before, and we heard that there's a RestController in Flow. But I mean, I was really amazed to see that it goes back until 2008. Basically, the very first commits included a RestController at some point. It's still not widely used, and it certainly has some problems and drawbacks, but we have it. I mean, as Willem pointed out, all the bits and pieces for creating services are in there. So use them, please. And finally, another thing that was happening back then was that everything was tagged. I mean, these days we use annotations quite a lot, but if you look at source code from 2008, 9, 10, 11 at some point, you have a huge mass of tags in your code. Up to a point where you have like this size of doc blocks just with tags that tell you who is the author of this method and in which package is it and which version is this and all this kind of stuff. Back then it was all annotated and it looked quite funny to look through the code to see all this stuff because the comments were even more amount of the code than these days. And finally, I found one thing in the code that is also in there since a long time. And you all might not know that you use this method, but actually your code does. We have a method that is this. And it's for fixing AOP advices in Doctrine proxies. Basically, it's a bug in Doctrine that doesn't allow us to do this. But we implemented this as a kind of AOP fix for it. and all your proxy classes will include this method and use this method. That's the only way it works, and that's the way advisors in AOP work with doctrine entities. But it's quite funny if you read this method name, and it's very long, and it specifically says it's a fix for a specific bug, and it's really in there since ages, since the first time we used doctrine in our project, and it's still in there today because we still need it. It might change with Doctrine 2.5 that we'll introduce hopefully soon, because that again introduces other problems where we need fixes for, but then we might finally get rid of this wonderful fixed methods and devices array for doctrine proxies thingy. It's really interesting what you find if you look through the source code. I mean, obviously I built a very great and cool crawling script that looked through all the source code and commit messages to do this talk. No, I actually just looked at the stuff, but it was quite interesting. Another thing, I don't know how often you look through the source code of the framework, and you should expect that we as core team somehow do that from time to time. But actually, in the preparation of this talk, I really looked at all the code and all the stuff to find this kind of things. I mean, that was my hope, that I find something. And I was lucky, I found something. Have you ever seen JSBN? It's a folder in Flow. It exists. You can look it up in your installations. Should be there since 2008 or something. Look in resources, public. In there, you will find a couple of JavaScripts. And I looked at the code and thought, why does Flow deliver JavaScript? Because it has not even a front end. I mean, it's a framework. Why should it even deliver any kind of JavaScript? So I went on a quest to find out why we have this JSBN in there. And what I found was that back then, even before Fluid existed, there was a wonderful login controller as part of Flow, which allowed you to obviously log in, I hope. I didn't test it. It had no template. It was basically hard-coded HTML in a PHP file. And this was a very sophisticated thing that could encrypt your password on the client side via JavaScript, and then send it encrypted to the server to log you in. And that used this JavaScript that was still there. The problem is, this controller and every PHP code surrounding that controller was already deleted 1 year later. Somehow, everyone forgot this little piece of JavaScript in there, and it survived since today. Actually, we deleted it 2 days ago. So next version will no longer include those wonderful JavaScripts. So if you, for some reason, found them and used them in your project, please be prepared that this is a breaking change that we didn't mark as breaking change because we don't expect that anyone is using this. So I hope you have a bit of an idea of this wonderful framework and how it went. Let's move on. Special appearance. This thing is very important. It's our wonderful VIBIEMME. She helped us, make it through a lot of code sprints and long nights coding, provided us always with a steady stream of espressos that actually Robert made, but VIBIEMME was so kind of providing them. And she has a special place in the framework if you ever want to deliver a 418 response code in Flow. You will actually deliver a 418 SONO VIBIEMME response code to the client you deliver the HTTP response to. 418, if you don't know, is actually the I'm a teapot response, and for us, it's I'm a coffee machine response. We are a coffee team. So another thing that helped us through long coding nights were the 205,967 versions of this song that we heard all night long and all day long at some point. I don't know. We had a lot of versions of this, and this is my personal favorite. Probably you can ask in the team, everyone will have a favorite cover version of this song. It's somehow the theme song of our team. Let's come to the templating engine, and I think I have to hurry a bit, so we should go faster. The templating language, this is actually where Beer 3 comes from, because it was actually, this is a commit message. This is not something. The commit message really read, committing first version of Beer 3. And back then, all the classes were named Beer 3. Whoever had that idea, I don't know. Probably Sebastian. Or, as we call him, what did I call him? The untouchable, obviously. Yeah, obviously, only the untouchable can commit something that is called Beer 3. And if you ever wanted to learn regular expressions, just look into the Fluid code. The Fluid parser is the example of regular expressions. It's wonderful. It's the way I learned regular expressions. Now I have at least some idea of regular expressions. I still couldn't write the Fluid parser probably, but it's the way to go. Just look at it. Then at some point, someone decided that Fluid might be a better name for Beer 3. I think so too. And for that, actually, there was a first renaming commit, but does not work yet. I really like that. Shortly after, there was this included in the code. And it was there for a few months, basically, because it was in some if condition that was rarely used. And at some point, someone noticed, oh, why do I get a yeah in my markup if I have this kind of Fluid template? And so it was removed. I kind of like it. I mean, it's a nice idea to say, yeah, but OK. And Fluid has actually one of the most prominent exception messages that I'm sure you all have seen. It's this one, even though it says, should never be thrown. I'm pretty sure all of you have seen this message one time or the other. Yeah, by now this exception message is gone. It's replaced by a more meaningful exception message that no longer says it should never be thrown, because it is a case that it should be thrown at some point. And there you go. We try to make stuff better, and I think that's really an improvement to no longer say it should never be thrown. You see, we have a lot of nice commit messages in this code. Especially if you go back in time. And I mean, this was a different time. It was Wild West back then. Everyone could just commit. There were no reviews. And there were actually also no CI. And at some point, we introduced this guy, another special appearance. And let him tell himself who he is.
Mr. Jenkins says,
It's Mr. Jenkins. And he said quite a lot during our code sprints, because this is actually OS X say command. And at some point, on a few code sprints, we hooked it up with the CI. So every time something was committed and Jenkins was doing stuff and building commits and building builds, we had some of the MacBooks in the sprint say, Mr. Jenkins says build failed. And actually, back then, he could have said arc, because that was a commit message back then. If you look through the code, there is a commit message that says arc, and in the description you see, I forgot to commit blah, 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 therefore it doesn't work, so that's the fixing commit. That's how it works if you have Wild West and no clear structure. But we are past that. We have wonderful commit message styles now, so everyone can understand what's going on. Let's move over to our content repository. And the content repository also has a very nice and long history of a lot of changes. And the first version used a JavaBridge, so it actually connected through PHP to Java code that connected to a Java implementation of the Java content repository, which is the GSR that we looked for back then. that was obviously kind of difficult and had no future because you had to install PHP, a web server, Java, the Java content repository, and a JavaBridge to make this work, which sounds not like a really useful solution for everyday usage. So the idea was to create a PHP CR, so a native implementation in PHP. And actually, if you look at the code again, you will find stuff like this. You see, we used PHP CR back then as class names. By now, PHP CR has evolved into a different project because some of the features that the Java content repository spec allows or not allows, basically, or the way it should work, are not compatible with the way we think about content repositories. For example, our dimension support and some of the other stuff that we implemented would have not been possible with the strict Java content repository standard. And PHP CR is more strict to the standard, so we deviated from each other and separate projects now. But if you look at this, what is this? Maybe some of you know. Basically, this is the early version of namespacing. While PHP introduced namespaces, they weren't sure how to separate namespaces from each other. And the first version that was merged into the basically working version, the master of PHP, used this to separate namespaces. So as early adapters as Flow and Fluid and Neos was, this was adopted right away. So at that point in time, you could run only with the PHP dev version, basically. And you had to use this kind of namespacing. Yeah, that became the Type 3 CR. And interestingly, back then, we had a repository browser. You could actually look through your content repository content and have a 3 view of all the stuff. But that was specific to the PHP CR back then and didn't really work anymore with the new implementation stuff that we have. So it's gone from the code. Too bad, really, because it's a useful tool. But I hope that we have something like that again in the future. And last thing about the content repository is context. If you work with Neos, you certainly have heard the term context. Wonderful. Let's talk about context. Which context are you talking about? Because I'm talking about the EEL context. I don't know what you are talking about. Actually, context is kind of a bad word, but it makes sense. It's the only way to describe a context. And we have quite a lot of them in Flow and Fluid and Neos. So just to give you a little bit of background and information, what we have, if you look through all of this, we have an application context. That's the way Flow runs. You have heard of development context and production context. That's the application context. That's the whole application, Flow, Neos, whatever you have. It all runs in one specific context. Then you have a security context that provides you with information about the current security status, like which tokens and which accounts are logged in. Again, this class and object is called context. It's also in Flow. Then you have the content repository context. That defines what kind of nodes you are seeing. So if you're looking at the live workspace or some user workspace, and which dimensions you're looking at. Again, totally separate thing, same name, separate thing. And finally, there is a TypeScript /EEL context. And that is the information which variables are available at that point in your rendering in TypeScript and EEL. Again, it's called context. So if you create if you use EEL in PHP, you will have to create a context to provide it to your EEL expression parser. So again, another context. So you have to be very specific if you talk about contexts in Flow and Neos. Just to let you know. Has led to wonderful confusion back then. OK, that's about the content repository. Let's have a quick detour before we come to the CMS and the final parts of this presentation. You all know that we changed the way our teams work, and we have introduced project-specific teams just last year. And part of that was that we introduced topic-specific groups of people working together. And this is in typical language that talks about this kind of community stuff. It's called a community of practice, because the people in this smaller sub-community share the same practice. They talk about JavaScript, for example. That's a community of practice. Or, for example, a TypoScript community of practice. Now, community of practice is a bit unwieldy to say all the time, and especially to write, let's say, in Slack or somewhere. So what do? We are all developers. What do? We make an abbreviation. So what comes out of that? COP. And for some reason, we were all not happy to be reminded of COPs all the time. We think about a community of practice, which is a peaceful and wonderful small place to talk about a specific topic. So COPs were somehow not a thing in our team, so we had to find a different name, and now they're called guilds. But I found it quite nice that this problem came up and that COPs are not a thing for us. So let's switch over to our wonderful CMS. And again here, I have looked with my magic parser through all the code and all the commits back then and all the information and all the files that are existing. And this is a draft of the backend from way back. That was the idea for the Neos backend. I think we are quite similar, let's say, almost. But yeah, there you see how the process was, and this was really a very first draft of something that could resemble a UI. And in the same process, personas were defined that should work with Neos. And I mean, personas is a nice idea. Somehow it really didn't work out, I feel. But looking at back then, these are the actual personas that were defined. They were quite cool. I mean, I like it. I especially like the rabbit guy here. I think that was the web developer for whatever reason. I don't know. I didn't make up those personas. But I still like this diagram of people somehow. And the whole CMS and all the components in it, like TypoScript, for example, again went through a lot of changes similar to the framework and the templating language. And I just want to point out one nice example. You might know about the wonderful snowboard tour that happens every year. And we had, for the longest of times, a comment in the code at a place where all of us knew there was a problem in this code, that this had to be fixed. But the implementation was back and was made at a snowboard tour years ago. And the comment read, "Fix after snowboard tour." There was just no date on it or no year. And so it was always like, yeah, well, next snowboard tour. So actually it stayed in there for, I think, 3 or 4 years until someone finally came to the conclusion that there will be no snowboard tour after which it's fixed, so we fix it at some other point in time. This is gone now, but was a very nice document of times. Let's talk about JavaScript for a second. We started with XJS back then. Very wonderful, not JavaScript framework. Anyway, back then it was the cool thing. We implemented it. It somehow worked. Our first backend was based on XJS. If you Google, you will find screenshots that are very ugly. So please don't do it. That was not the same product. It's not us. So that was the thing. And at the point where we wanted to introduce editing, this mysterious man in a hat came to the rescue, maybe, and helped us to implement Crate.js and VIE. And if you look at the video that I showed you a snippet of with Renz in it, he says there basically that the Neos community is the reason why those products exist. The problem is, the idea was that other CMSs also use them and you can exchange editors and stuff. This unfortunately never happened. We are still probably the only ones using these. So if you look at our diagram from here, basically all of this part, all the gray parts will be thrown out with the new backend. Front-end editing obviously is still a thing, but in a different way. But a lot of craft will be gone with the new user interface coming and based on React. So looking at all the JavaScript frameworks that we used, you have to ask the serious question, what is next after React? I hope nothing for the short term, but I mean, the JavaScript world is very quickly evolving. So I mean, we are always a team that adopts new technologies, and you should too, because it makes sense. So who knows, maybe there is something next after React. Then just a short detour, content migration tool. We had this actually back then in 2012, where Neos not even existed. Unfortunately, it was never used, and now it's no longer existing, but somehow someone thought that it's a good idea to have a migration tool back then. And we always have one more thing. That's what I have too. So one more thing is our in-between vision for the user interface, for the current user interface. So this is a vision that you see right now in the user interface, but isolated from the full idea and vision of the user interface. I find this quite funny, because the idea is to use architecture for the user interface, and you have something like streets and homes that separate private and public places in the UI, which somehow makes sense, but looking at this on your own is quite a funny. Then this is TypoScript, obviously. I don't know if you can read it, more or less. This is TypoScript. But this is TypoScript back from 2010. And it's still very similar to what we have today, even though the underlying PHP implementation changed about 3 times in between. So you see, we try to make it as easy as possible for you to keep using the same stuff while we change and improve. I think that's quite nice. And I don't know, this could be, no, this is not, but back then, T3Con 2011 was the first website based on Neos. And actually, at that point in time, we didn't have the capabilities to edit. So all the content was edited in a big XML file and then imported to the website. But we had a website on Neos. It was quite cool. And then you might have noticed earlier in the talk that I had with Sebastian, we talked about extensibility, and at one point we talked about plugins. And actually, I tried to find an example for plugin, but there is none. I mean, all the websites that I know about and that other people knew about said, no, we don't have plugins in our website. And our customer project, no, we never used a plugin. Did you ever implement a plugin? And we finally found this website with the plugin on it that we didn't implement. But in the end, it's quite funny that plugins are obviously something you want to have and at some point you need, but it's really rare, even at bigger websites right now, that you have plugins or even a lot of them. So that's quite nice. To finalize this, I have very few impressions of code sprints just to give you an idea how this all went. This is back from the beginning of the project. We had nice barbecues. We had a houseboat that was really nice. We had very tiny rooms and sat there late at night coding away. We had a very nice launch event of Neos 1.0. We used cards a lot to organize Code Sprint, which works quite well, I can tell you. We had a castle. And we had very nice code sprints all in all. And I will stop here because I think I'm over time. And I will finish with this, my signature. Contact me about anything you want to know about the project, any questions you have. And I hope that you had some fun, you're awake, you're ready for the next presentation, and you also learned something. Thank you.